One example of where you might use saturation in a very obvious way is to alter the timbre of an instrument to prevent it from getting lost in a mix, or to balance a mix when there's a lack of energy in the mid and high frequencies. Listen to this. In this example, I've purposefully left out some of the other tracks that would normally fill the higher frequency ranges. But let's pretend for the sake of this video that this is the arrangement and nothing can be done about that. Even though I'd recommend getting the arrangement right before calling it done. But anyway, while you can sometimes fill in the higher frequency ranges with a simple EQ boost, maybe there isn't enough energy in the desired frequency range to simply boost with EQ. In these cases, you might use saturation to redistribute energy from lower frequencies into higher frequency ranges that aren't already present. When I solo the 808 sample, we see and hear that there's energy up to about 300 Hertz, but not much above that. Using Decapitator, we can saturate the track, which will result in harmonically related energy higher in the spectrum. This is important. It's not just random noise, it's actually an extension of the original signal. It kind of messes up the tone of the 808 when you just crank up the drive, so to preserve the dry tone while enhancing the higher frequencies, we can try dialing back the amount of wet signal, just blending in the amount we need. Another instance where you might use saturation is to allow for low-frequency instruments to be heard on playback systems that are limited in their ability to produce low frequencies. This is often more subtle because you don't necessarily want to use saturation as an effect in your mix, but instead you want to use it to simply excite frequencies that are harmonically related to a particular instrument so that that element can be heard even on a smartphone speaker. Let's take, for example, the kick drum in this song. It's coming through pretty well on full range speakers, but what if we played it back on a smartphone, which has small speakers that will effectively high pass what the listener is hearing? Now it's much more difficult to hear the kick, although you can still hear it because that kick does have some higher frequency content already. But if we were to use saturation on the kick, we'll generate some more higher frequency content that can be reproduced by the smartphone. So even though the smartphone can't provide the full tone of the kick drum as you'd get on full range speakers, at least you know the kick drum is there. And our minds will often reverse engineer those higher frequencies, leading to somewhat of a phantom fundamental frequency that's not really there, even though you can perceive it. Of course, you need to find a balance where there's enough saturation to achieve this effect, but not so much as to damage the tone of the instrument. Saturation has been a part of classic recordings throughout the decades. That's because analog gear is nonlinear, meaning you can't always predict the output simply based on the input and a simple function. This has led to lots of experimentation with different circuits over those decades and has defined what sounds good, rich, warm, brittle, and nostalgic for all of us. Productions just keep evolving based on what came before them, which I find very cool. One particularly iconic example of this is a saturation effect on a vocal. You can use lots of saturation for the overdrive effect you might hear in a Black Keys album or a Sam Cooke recording, similar to this. Or you can tone it back a bit by dialing back the drive knob. Or you can keep the drive knob high and dial it back by blending it in with the mix knob. Baby, we're gold. The more subtle uses are again not so much a special effect, but rather a way to spread out energy throughout the spectrum in a way that sounds organic and harmonically related to the source. It's not just an EQ boost. Rather than boosting frequencies, it's creating frequencies that weren't there before. I've heard this described as a halo effect, and I think that's a really helpful way of understanding how to hear saturation in many cases. Listen to the distortion of the fundamental, but understand that the effects you'll hear with saturation will extend upward in the frequency spectrum. Here's a final example, but this one is very important because it demonstrates that saturation can be harnessed through the use of other tools, not just saturation plugins. Now I've added an aggressive compressor plugin called Soundtoys Devil Lock Deluxe into another plugin called Plugin Doctor. If the plugin is bypassed, this line will just be straight because the input and output have a one-to-one relationship. But when I engage the plugin, let's see what happens. The behavior is seemingly linear up until the point where the threshold is reached. Then there's some reduction between the input and output, and that means the waveform will be distorted. Putting this on drums will therefore achieve some of that same harmonic distortion we've been discussing, which can be really cool in parallel, using the mix knob, or as an effect on room mics to create a very big drum sound. This is just one of the infinite ways to use a compressor to add color to a mix. A very important point I'm trying to make is that saturation and harmonic distortion are inevitable in any nonlinear signal path. Because when you change the shape of the waveform, you change the frequency components that make it up, and vice versa. So the next time you're dialing in a limiter or compressor, listen not only for the changes to the envelope and dynamics of the sound, but also to the distortion that will occur, exciting higher frequency harmonics. In other words, compressors and limiters aren't just dynamics processors, but they're also spectral processors with the ability to shape the frequency balance of a mix. These saturation techniques and effects can be applied to individual instruments, buses, or even effects like delay. In fact, the Soundtoys Echo Boy plugin has a built-in saturation effect for exactly this purpose.